Contextual constriction, corsets, and the narratives that surround them. Corset. What terms come to mind when you hear that word? Constraint, constriction, breathlessness, fainting, falling, tightness, or something else altogether. The corset is a mythological figure in a sense. It occupies a space in which time, media, and moral structures have christened this piece of historical fashion with a slew of negative associations. They are perhaps most known for their place in movies, with hugely bosomed women gasping and shrieking as they cling to dear life to a bedpole, forcibly tightened into a fabric death trap. Take the corseting scene in Gone with the Wind from 1939, which shows the main character Scarlett struggling to be fit by her maid into her undergarments, all for the sake of seducing a man. Or the more modern Bridgerton, in which the very first scene shows an extremely similar display of tightening, pulling, stretching, and squeezing to create the tiniest waist possible before meeting Queen Charlotte. While much of this exaggeration is done for show, it reveals a much more commonly held view of corsets in wider society. Corsets are dangerous, oppressive, and most importantly, constrictive. However, in recent years there has been a shift in this viewpoint. Particularly in the online sphere, more and more people have discussed the validity of these narratives, promoting a more positive view on the garment. Indeed, the main inspiration for my research was a content creator on YouTube by the name of Bernadette Banner, a seamstress in New York who studies antique clothing, including corsetry from the Victorian period. It is these new, more modern takes that I wish to dissect alongside the older claims. What is the corset's true place in society, and why did it change? There are a few things that will be talked about before getting into the main body of my research. The first is the difference between corsets and stays. While there is debate in the fashion history community as to where this distinction lies or whether it is actually needed, I will be making the distinction here. Stays are an older type of shapewear made from layers of thick material bound together to make the garment stiff. Corsets, on the other hand, provide support through the boning channels, bound together by panels of fabric to create a single, cohesive piece of clothing. The boning material could be made of actual bone, horns, or other organic material, or inorganic, such as steel or, more recently, plastic. No stays are referred to in this research, as it focuses mostly on corsetry. Corsets were also usually supported by a busk, which ran down the middle of the corset to provide stability and style. Tight lacing is another definition that comes up frequently in my research. It's defined as lacing a corset further than what it should be, particularly when it forces dramatic shifts in the body of the wearer to accommodate the small space it now occupies. I wish to also now make mention of how my research approaches gender. A large portion of research on corsetry talks in terms of cis men and cis women. And though gender nonconformists appear in literature, there are very few specific mentions of transgender or non-binary people. I will therefore be talking mostly in terms of cisgender people, but I will be branching out in the last section to discuss the wider impacts of corsetry, constriction, and social perceptions of sex and gender. Medicine and patterns. One of the most overt areas in which corsetry and constriction align is the physical. Corsets are designed first and foremost to bind and shape the figure. Most of the time, the shape it is designed to emulate is the hourglass figure, defined as having larger hips and a bust, with a small waist. Out of all the shapes that bodies can come in, it has historically been considered one of the most desirable, particularly by men. While most of the modern ideas we have around body shapes we consider attractive are based in bogus psychological studies such as Singh's 1993 Adaptive Significance of Female Physical Attractiveness, Role of Waist to Hip Ratio paper, almost all of these studies focus on weird, that being Western, educated, industrialized, rich and democratic countries. It is true that in the Western world, at least, hourglass figures have been sought after for centuries. Elizabethan dresses from England embody this classic shape, flaring out in the appropriate places to show both bustiness and enormous hips. Rococo period dresses emphasize smaller waists by contrasting them with huge crinolines and petticoats, layering to create a swooping effect all the way from the waist to the ground. These styles feature corsetry as a major way to shrink the look of the waist, and as corsetry is heavily exacerbated in Victorian garb for women, part of which being informed by the fact that all of a sudden The extra padding in both the skirt and the upper shoulders have disappeared from mainstream fashion, leaving corsets as the last bastion to shrink the actual waist. The very nature of corsets is to slim down the waist through constriction, using physical binding for the viewing pleasure of men. However, the extent of this constriction is much more nuanced than what the major narratives say. Some talking points are straight up untrue, such as the talking point that women were undergoing surgeries to remove ribs for smaller waists, something that would have had to have been performed without anesthesia and likely would have killed most participants through infection. There are some truths to this discussion, such as how the physical reality of binding had measurable impacts on organ displacement, such as skeletal warping, but taking a closer look at the social place and impact of corsetry shows a valuable and relatively unrecognized perspective on how corsets fit physically into our history. The first thing that must be addressed is the actual biological impact of constriction. Gibson discusses thoroughly in her book The Corseted Skeleton the physical side effects of corsetry, particularly focusing on the skeletal aspect. Mainstream ideas of constriction through corsetry suggest that wearing corsets was a physically demanding activity. It's described as a painful, arduous process to not only get laced into the corset, but to move around in it. The restriction on breathing and flexibility inducing fainting spells in the women who wore them. While there is some truth to these statements, a lot of the overall impact of wearing a corset has been overstated due to a long period of propagandizing from dress reformists, patriarchy, and different types of entertainment media. Gibson also describes the rib cages of corseted women as certainly having changes in their overarching shape, being considerably narrower than what we would expect to see from uncorseted women. Wearing the corset has undeniably changed their bones to be shaped to the garment, in turn resulting in smaller spaces for organs, such as the lungs within the torso area, which could potentially result in breathlessness. However, one very important factor to consider is the way in which corsets were usually introduced to upper-class women. All children in the upper echelon, no matter their gender, were raised in corsets specifically designed for children, equipped with more flexibility for their flailing limbs and arms. This corseting continued till around the ages of 4 to 8, where boys transitioned into breeches and girls began to adopt their adult corsets. Doctors of the time believed this was a necessity to support growing bodies of children to prevent deformities, though they incorrectly pushed the idea that women's bodies were naturally weaker than men's, and so therefore required extra support into adulthood. This medical sexism was combined with the idea that women should be weak and delicate, so being slim and frail was perceived to be a mark of beauty, much like experiencing consumption or other diseases. However, the transition into a boned corset from childhood created an interesting phenomenon. The women subjected to this constriction were not forced into the corset so much as grew into it. Post-puberty, trying to squeeze into a corset is a much harder task if your body has been uncorseted your whole life. But having your body molded as you grow creates a permanent change in your form. It allows the body to develop the tiny waist described in history books, going all the way down from 20 inches to 18, 16, 14, small as 8. In a way, this binding is somewhat similar to the women of the Kayan tribes in Thailand, who from a young age begin to wear metal coils around their neck to stretch them, elongating their necks as they age. Both the neck coils and corsets utilize constraints to change the shape of the body in ways that otherwise would be completely unattainable, both of which are done for the ideals of beauty and femininity. However, the way in which corsets function mean that the overall damage to the body may not be so severe as it seems. Fainting spells, described by doctors of the time, were not necessarily caused by the corsetry, so much as a mixture of tight lacing, heavy clothes, and hot weather. The organ displacement was also unlikely to have caused as much difficulty functioning as suspected, as while certainly not easy, more displacement occurs when experiencing pregnancy. The more drastic symptoms are also usually only seen in women who participated in tight lacing, rather than those who wore corsets in general. Tight lacing, as described earlier, is characterized by going too far when lacing up the corset. It pushes the body beyond its limits in a dangerous manner to attempt to achieve not just a tiny waist, but a classic wasp waist. The wasp-waisted figure is typically incredibly tiny, caused by intense and dangerous levels of lacing to force the waist to shrink down to tiny levels. It results in heavily restricted breathing and movement from the user. It was supposedly desirable by men, but ultimately was viewed as a grotesque form of mutilation, even in the Victorian period. The idea that women from all walks of life were suffering extreme harm from corseting in general originates from the doctors of the 19th century. They pushed the idea that all types of corsetry were medically significant and harmful to the body. Ironically enough, they all did this while producing their own patents for corsets, shown by literature such as Gibson and Steele. Researchers like Gibson have also found that corseted women actually live longer than the average person of the time, perhaps due to being of a higher class. The constraints of knowledge from the medical society, as well as the medical sexism, bleed together to exaggerate the existing symptoms and side effects from corsetry, and have created a powerful narrative around lacing and the harm it might cause. Branching off these issues of the true nature of the damage that corsetry can do, comes the question of whether women in the late 19th century would have used lacing for their own personal gain. Many women did during this time. Many women of the time, particularly as part of the suffragette movement, embodied dress reformist ideals and decried corsetry as a practice, such as the New Zealand Rational Dress Association, the NZRDA. It's quoted to have said that it aimed to bring about that change in women's dress in which her wider life and increased activity seemed to demand. Others yet describe their experiences with corseting as empowering, at least empowering for the 19th century. Constriction of the body could be used not just as a tool to increase sexual appeal in the wearer, engaging with the heteronormative society of the time in an acceptable way, but instead for their own individualistic purposes. Some women found strength in embracing lacing, using the constraint it provided to change their bodies into the shapes that they wanted. It symbolized a transition from being a girl to being a woman, something that many found desirable. Many of those who tight-laced did so in a society which looked at it as a source of vanity. They were not rewarded for their tight-lacing so much as ostracized for it. Pushing their bodies beyond the limit was something they desired to do, and so they did. You could liken this to the body modification community in modern day, with people pushing their bodies to their limits in order to see what they can truly handle. Much like a modern-day body modification goal, such as plastic surgery, there was some pride held for undergoing an intense constriction regime, shrinking into smaller and smaller ways till they hit their own goals. It was physical proof that they could stand the regimented lacing sessions enough to keep going down in sizes. It was also a way of expressing femininity through physical means, highlighting the hourglass figure and creating a more delicate frame through this method. It bears a surprisingly strong resemblance to modern-day cosmetic surgeries. The vast majority of people engaging in plastic surgery are women, totaling nearly 93% of all cosmetic surgeries in the UK, according to the 2021 BAAP's audit. Many of these surgeries focus on changing aspects of the self to fit beauty standards, such as facial surgeries, lip and butt fillers, breast augmentations. These surgeries carry with them dangers and are generally done with the goal of increasing social acceptance by making themselves more attractive, something we will delve more into later. These surgeries, much like corsetry, have a complicated relationship with maneuvering the restrictive social environments we find ourselves in. For both the 19th century and the modern day, the world around us dictates that being seen as a beautiful Instagram model or a TikTok star should be the ultimate goal for a young woman. And so pursuit of beauty through these constrictive, physically taxing, and dangerous means is just another symptom of a very large and overwhelming problem with the patriarchal society we see today. We might have discarded the corset as our method of binding, but instead we have taken up other means of perpetuating the issue at hand. Makeup, bras, surgery, and shapewear are the corresponding modern-day equivalents of the physical changes women will go through in an effort to fit into social beauty standards. Many women today find empowerment in embracing these tools, much like the Victorians did. Ultimately, however, it cannot be ignored that the reason why we find many of these items empowering lies in their oppressive realities. The choices are limited, so women must use every last option to forge their own way through life. Economics and class structures. Economics makes up a large portion of our daily lives, whether we like it or not. The capitalist society we live in dictates that money must be made and money must be spent. From the essentials to the highest of luxuries, our day-to-day lives are governed by money and where it goes. This system applies to clothing, both modern and historical. Much like how late-stage capitalism can certainly be defined as an oppressing force in society, there is a strong economic basis behind the relationship between corsetry and constriction. Class rules, rising consumerism, and ever-increasing amount of fast fashion have existed for centuries, and the corset encapsulates some of these shifting tides. Class distinctions have always existed in human civilization. From the richest to the poorest, highest to lowest, there have always been divides based on wealth, land, and product ownership. With this class difference, there came a need to clearly visually separate one from another. Clothes all around the world have become a symbol of status for the wearer as much as a symbol of their personality. Jewelry, shoes, fabric, and more suggest the position of the wearer in the society they live in. Maori culture, for example, involves feathered cloak using tui and wood pigeon feathers to denote high status in a tribe. In China, only the emperor could wear yellow for centuries. In Europe, heavily embroidered fabrics were usually only bought and worn by the rich till their later industrial revolution. Corsets play into this distinction in a very similar way, particularly in the Victorian period. They became tools to show your position in society as high or low class. Part of the corset mythos is that most women who lived in the Victorian period were not just wearing corsets, but participating in the act of tight-lacing. However, tight-lacing was a practice only realistically associated with upper-class women. Poorer or lower-class women rarely wore corsets that were of the same style and shape as the upper class, as seen in Styles' paper from 2007. Lower-class women usually purchased second-hand corsets that had fallen out of style or from cheaper brands, but they did not engage with tight-lacing. Tight-lacing was an act of status, of the heightened superiority to be able to restrict yourself in such a way. It signified another form of constriction within society, that of the constraint of class ideals and responsibilities. Lower-class women were usually expected to work to bring an income back into their households to support both themselves and any family they might have. Often they were working in grueling physical conditions, lifting and bending and rushing and sweating just to earn their keep. Tight-lacing wasn't just considered vain, it was impractical for a lower-class woman. As discussed in the previous section on medicine, corseting too far does indeed cause physical strain and injury if sustained for too long, especially if somebody tries to move too much while corseted. It also very much restricts the ability of the wearer to move, particularly when it comes to bending over or twisting around. Lower-class women just didn't have the time or energy to corset to that extent, despite all women wearing them at the time. Upper-class women, on the other hand, had the luxury benefit of time on their side. Women who belonged to the upper echelon were not expected to engage in much physical labour during this time. They would perform mental tasks such as running the household, but while these can be mentally laborious chores, they're certainly not physically strenuous. The less physical activity a lady had to do, the more time and opportunity she had to engage in tight-lacing. In a way, the physical constriction developed a secondary type of constriction, one that is a symptom of class structure. Physical labour dictated the fashions that each woman could wear according to her positions in life, enabling the choice to engage in constriction for upper-class women through the enabling of constrictive social elements from society. Economically, corsets also symbolize another form of constriction placed upon women, namely monetary. Purchase and sales of goods in a free market system has been the economic state for hundreds of years, something which can be argued to have gotten worse as we are entering a new phase of capitalism in the 21st century. Fashion has always played into this market system, both for class reasons as mentioned above, but also for more personal stylistic reasons. Expressing your individual personality through clothing, costume, and decoration has been a part of human culture for hundreds of thousands of years. Corsets truly are just another method of expressing that personality. Even when hidden underneath a bodice or other types of dress, corsets were stylish items. They came in many shapes and colours, these options broadening out even more with the advent of the Industrial Revolution. First-hand corsets also became increasingly available to women of middle and lower classes due to the reduced labour and material costs during the Industrial Revolution, introducing, arguably, the first significant example of fast fashion. As their audience broadened, however, this reveals another constrictive conundrum around corsetry, the expectation to wear them. To be seen without a corset at the time was to appear slovenly, unkempt, unladylike. Women would therefore be expected to both purchase and wear these garments, introducing a potential beginning form of the pink tax we see in the 21st century. This financial form of constriction applies far beyond the corsets in both historical and modern times, but it represents a symptom of this growing issue. There are extra expectations placed upon women to appear pretty, clean, and tidy, but our requirements to be presentable are far higher than that surrounding men. Looking delicate and feminine is also part of this list, societal rules dictating that a corset was required to achieve a certain look. The extra costs associated with purchasing a garment like this are restrictive unto themselves, causing unnecessary financial burden on the people of the time. Of course, the other side to being a consumer of corsetry was to be the producer. Victorian society featured a number of women working in a myriad of positions during this time, though most of them were regulated to lower positions in terms of both status and pay. As is unfortunately reflected today, there is a disparity between men and women and the positions they are liable to work in and be praised for. Women are not chefs, they are cooks. Women are not doctors, they are nurses. And in the Victorian age, women were not tailors, they were seamstresses. Most women working in the corset industry worked as part of the factory lines, cutting and shaping and crafting the corsets to be purchased later. Work hours were very intensive, and the conditions were not often that great. However, it provided a space for women to enter the workforce and earn their own money in a respectable fashion. Commercial fashion and beauty in the late 19th century was increasingly women-led, particularly in the top ranks. Florence Pannell famously owned her own beauty shop during this period, using her identity as a woman to make her business successful against her male competitors. Factory work as a corset maker was also not as strenuous necessarily as being, say, a collier, shown by Worth in their 2020 book. Being at the top of a pile as a woman allowed for even more financial freedoms from this career. However, the undergarment field faltered for a moment in time during the late 1800s for a few reasons. The first being that doctors were pushing their narrative that corsets were irreprehensible tools of trickery and danger, and that either the natural figure should be embraced or their own patented, certainly not the same, corsets would solve all of their issues. Another aspect was the patriarchal men who wanted a slice of the corsetry pie, but they faced a few issues to enter this field. Corsets, even in the height of the Industrial Revolution, were difficult to mass produce. Unlike navy and military outfits, which were standardized and therefore very much suited the industrialized reform, corsets had to accommodate a myriad of shapes and sizes, and even then were usually tailored to a specific person. With no clear way in, most of these men decided to produce hit pieces on the practice. They created articles aligning with the dress reformers and their ideas to promote their own new and less restrictive, quote-unquote, bras and girdles over the single-piece corset. Combined with the changing silhouettes in the 1920s for the more column-shaped flapper girl aesthetic, corset producers eventually closed their doors shortly into the 20th century. While some of the people involved in the downfall of corsetry were women, the eventual abandonment altogether was in large part to do with men. Their desire for money, as well as their own inflexible beliefs about women earning a living, cost plenty of women both their jobs and their livelihoods. Sex, morality, and kink. In the final section, I'll be covering the strange and complicated relationship between corsetry and sex, modernity and morality. There is a strong connection tying corsets to sexuality. It is perhaps what they are known for most. Their physical purpose is to highlight the figure of the wearer, making it designed to effectively enhance the sexual appearance of the wearer. Most of the people donning corsets in the Victorian period acknowledged this aspect of their function, as it became a large part of the discourse surrounding corsetry during this period, as exhibited by Jill Fields with her 2003 piece. Pro-corset people argued that corsets were used in order to enhance femininity and beauty, while anti-corset arguments centered around the goal of desexualizing the female form, focusing on the idea of natural and wild beauty being superior. Many dress reformers criticized the hypersexuality of constricted clothing, arguing it was better to be unrestricted in more practical garments. However, the morality of the undergarments in the Victorian period was a double-edged sword. Women were vixens if they showed off their figures with corsets, but chastised as being loose and unkempt if they left their house without one. This Christian-based moral conundrum has persisted into the modern day, where bras are treated in a very similar respect, sexy if worn, lazy if not. Women existed, and still do, in this Madonna whore complex, a state in which women are constrained to the status of slut no matter what they try. However, there is evidence that women of the Victorian age were able to harness what power they had through dress to take charge of their own sexuality and presentation, something that will be explored further in this section. Sexuality, particularly that of women and other feminine-presenting people, has historically been strictly controlled. During the Victorian period, Christian-based morality was, on the surface, assigned and quite strictly adhered to by the people. While portrayals of Victorian society can overplay the rigidness of their social rules, many of these exceptions to the rules applied only to the men's society, such as sleeping around or excessive drinking or not conforming to heterosexual standards. Women and other AFAB people were expected in both private and personal lives to adhere to the gendered rules society had laid out for them, while releasing themselves from these rules when it benefited the men around them. One of the ways in which this manifested was through corsetry and sex. One of the issues identified by Christian-based morality structures is that of revealing the body, deeming it a form of temptation. Wearing a corset therefore indulges in this temptation, highlighting the curves of the wearer and creating temptation to be fought against. Many, such as Fowler, a doctor who argued against tight lacing during the Victorian period, argued that a more natural figure was both more desirable and moral. He argued in one of his books that women who corseted up would never make it into heaven due to their sinful actions. However, there were many others who considered uncorseted women to be immoral in their own rights. As outlined by Fields and Summers, many women who did not dress in the conventional styles of the period were considered to be wild and troublesome, almost feral in nature. It did not matter whether this rebellion against the status quo occurred in private or public, or how much it was witnessed. It was all tarred with the same brush. In such a lose-lose scenario, some women took it upon themselves to embrace their corsets as a way to flaunt their own sexuality. Accounts from women at the time describe how plenty of women enjoyed the feeling of sexiness and attractiveness that their corsets gave them. In a more modern sense, it indulged a gender euphoria, giving these women a chance to exist as a woman of the time, a desirable being in a time in which presenting yourself in such a way was looked down upon. While there are problems with relying on your own sexuality for self-worth, in a place where your very existence is criticized as being hypersexual, making the choice to embrace that side of you is its own form of rebellion. Corsets and their relationship to gender is immensely complicated, particularly when considering gender euphoria and dysphoria. Corsets are invariably linked to femininity as a default, a societal narrative constraint placed on the garment. They were designed for, worn by, and manufactured by mainly women. For many years were deemed medically necessary to shape their very figures. Even the busk is described as being akin to the erection of a man pressed against his lover's bosom, as seen in Alexander Pope's Rape of the Lock, or Edward Phillips in his story The Mysteries of Love and Eloquence. However, women are not the sole gender to actively engage with corsetry. Throughout all of history, there have been instances of men and what we can only presume as non-binary people who have donned corsets for their own purposes, though the practice kicked up a lot more in the early 19th century due to changing fashions for the men's shape, which, much like women, included smaller, thinner waists. Some men were known to wear corsets for the purpose of creating a shapely figure for themselves for fashion's sake. Sometimes it was to combat the effects of unmasculine, quote-unquote, features, such as being overweight or having physical deformities. Being overweight was considered a mark of gluttony, a trait deemed immoral in the Victorian period, just as physical deformities were also thought as brandings of an ill character. Corsets were used to portray fitter, more youthful bodies by the manipulation of body fat. In a fascinating twist of events, an object defined by its connection to femininity can, and was, used as a tool to enhance masculinity through constriction, all for the same root purposes of fashion and trimness. Despite being worn by people of all genders, however, the corset eventually all but faded from use by the 1930s. However, they have survived as a style and a craft to the modern day. Two major intersecting areas helped keep corsetry alive, besides the fashion buffs, of course. These societies, being the queer and kink communities. The kink community in particular embraced corsetry with open arms, perhaps encouraged more by the ever-increasing tabooness of corsetry as a tool of constriction. It is perhaps one of the few areas in which corsetry has persisted into the modern day, with the explicit idea of constriction being prevalent. Steele's book Fetish describes the fashion of fetish gear being mostly focused on a few central ideas depending on the wearer. showing off the body and engaging in humiliation. One interesting aspect of BDSM and kink side of corsetry is that the majority of people engaging with it were still women. Both submissive and dominant women would don corsets as a sign of their strength or frailty, reflecting the state of corsetry in the Victorian period. They were worn to be sexy, to show off their curves as a performance for the male gaze, while clad in leather and latex. For men, however, corsets and other garments associated with women and femininity were largely worn to humiliate rather than titillate. Making a man engage with femininity was to shoot him down, bring him down to the level of a woman. If they wore non-feminine gear, it tended to refocus back to the idea of showing off the body, such as through harnesses or other tight-fitting gear to show off muscles. However, there were growing subsections of men wearing corsets who chose to do so for far different reasons. While some of these people may have indeed been trans without the language or ideas to express it, cross-dressers and drag queens also indulged in corsetry and expressions of hyperfemininity while maintaining masculinity. This was done with the purpose of playing and acting a role rather than just participating in an act of humiliation. In all of these scenarios, however, no matter the personal purpose, there lies the underlying idea that these acts are all performed for the male gaze. How much of the ideas of personal choice and societal rules can be pulled apart is unfortunately quite small. One informs the other, and so while actively engaging with kink and corsetry without the maze is doable, it certainly plays a heavy and constraining role in the act. Corsetry and constriction are invariably complicated topics. There is no strict black or white ruling as to whether or not this relationship is good or bad, merely that it exists, and we must be critical of it when necessary and accepting when required. There are very valid pro- and anti-corset arguments, each of which having their own ideas as to whether corsetry was a good thing and whether or not we should return to it in the modern day and age. Walking into a shopping centre, you can see rows and rows of stores proudly displaying corset-like garments, advertised towards young women in an effort to display figures and midsections. While this trend is likely just that, a trend, it might be a symptom of a larger societal problem that we can discuss but struggle to fix. Whether this issue be body image, attempts to appear wealthier or more beautiful, or just to fit in with the rise and fall of fashion, we are still constricted to societal rules. These rules dictate our dress, our gender, our expressions. We live in a world where this corsetry aesthetic is occurring in a new, late-stage capitalist and postmodern feminist society. What attitudes do these items really hold in the modern day? How can we relate with them beyond the ideas of constriction? It might be possible to strip corsets of their negative or hypersexualized associations, but as of now, they are still very firmly connected to them in social media. However, the tides are shifting. With the rise of fashion historian YouTubers such as Bernadette Banner and Carolina Zabrowska, will we see new perspectives rear their head in popular media? Will we see a new Bridgerton in which corsets are appropriately used? For now, engaging with the literature and developing more nuanced ideas on corsetry is what is needed, so that we might one day present informed portrayals of corsetry in the future,